Welcome back to Sewing with Sir Mari. This is the second of a two-part video on how to construct a puncture-resistant fencing hood. This is for wearing under the mask, and we will go over now how to put it together. There are multiple ways that this can be done. We're going to go over a couple of methods so that you can add those to your skill set. When putting together the hood, you want to make sure that you have a right side and a left side. In doing so, I take my outer layer and I separate it, folding it so that it is opposite one to the other. And then I'm going to take my interlining and I'm going to place it the same way so that I know I have a left side and a right side, and I don't wind up having the two intermixed and in the wrong layer sequence. With something like this with only two layers, it makes sense. You probably don't need to do higher math to figure it out. However, once you start doing sleeves and start doing things that have multiple pieces, this becomes an important factor to look into. So we're going to put them together this way, and then the outside of my material, which I am going to call the right side of the material versus the wrong side of the garment, we are going to put those right sides together. And I'm going to sew through all four layers, creating them into one unit. So all of these will get pinned together on the area that I'm going to sew them, which is around the back of the hood, and then down this small bit of the front. I have put together my four layers, the two outer and the two inner linings, and you can see I have one. I have the right sides of my outside material together, 1, 2, and the other half of my interlining. I've also put together my lining because that's going to go next. And you can see that I have pinned around the top of the head and down the neck and then down the front. I used a different color pen to mark where I want this stitching to stop. I'm going to use a 5/8 seam allowance or a 1.5 centimeter because I find that that works best for my purposes. So, on to the sewing machine. In our first video of doing the one-piece hood, I went over the sewing machine and how it functions. So if you would like a refresher course on that, please see that video and you can see how that all works. I'm going to set my stitch length to 3, which is a fairly long stitch length, however not so long as 4, which I would use for doing basting, and not so tight as to cause super little stitches. I'm using a fairly thick needle. It is an 80-12, although with the amount of denim that I'm using, since I'm sewing through 4 layers here and 2 layers for my lining, that having a thicker one would not be amiss. And because it is denim, using a jeans needle would be fine, but I think we're going to be fine with our 80-12. So we start at the face edge. I reverse to lock my stitch, keeping this at 1.5. I sew, and you can see my needles are perpendicular to the edge so that I can pull them out easily. I keep tension on my fabric, but I don't pull as I sew. Bury my needle when I manipulate my fabric so that I don't lose my place and cause missed stitches. Because pins lie, you can see this is shifted slightly. So using them only as a guidance, I manage this so that it is lined up again. Alright, so now we have sewn together the front to this point, and we have sewn the back up and around. And I went ahead and clipped some of my seam allowance, which will allow this to turn better. You can see here that there are V-cuts. The V cut is because this is bigger than this, and when I turn this seam, these guys will be on the inside. By having the V cut, it allows them to lay without being extra bulky. On the back of the neck here, you can see that I cut a slash. I could also do a V cut, but I have the slash because this, being a concave curve, when it comes back in, these are going to separate out and create a V. So here, these are being compressed into a smaller area, and so need to have a V cut out of them. These are slashed and separate as they gets turned inside out. You can see here where I did not cut it yet that this creates bulk and issue on the inside of my hood. To know where to cut, ideally, the way to figure it out is to go ahead and push them to the inside, and you can see where this wants to bulk, and that bulks. And so if I clip those out as triangles, then they're going to lay smoothly. And you can see that's about enough. I can make this steeper or shallower depending on how this curve goes, and if I need to have more cut out. Having them be a little bit separated once they turn to the inside isn't a bad thing, but you don't want them cut so your V cut so shallowly that you wind up having them bend over the top of each other, because that creates extra bulk. Here in the front, where these are going to open up to attach to the other side, the lining, you can see that I cut this at a downward angle as opposed to just straight in where the end of my stitching is. And that's because as I sew this to the lining, or if I'm not going to do a lining, I could just roll this back, and that allows this area here to hide this raw edge more efficiently into the seams as I open this up. So if I was rolling that, that would fold here. The front of the hood would open up and fold across it there, allowing for that natural bend, and those could be folded back again to hide the frayed edge. We're going to line it, so that's not going to be an issue for us, but this seam is still going to need to open up. So I press open all of my seams, and I can do that by using the pointy end of the ironing board, or as I introduced in the last video, this is a sewing ham, and it is made of wool, and it is densely packed so that I can put pins into it if I need to, but it gives me a rounded surface for ironing a rounded object. Open up my seams, and I use the pointy end of the iron to press these open, being aware that with the steam setting, it is possible for the steam to roll along this seam right into my fingers. So I iron that one flat using my ham. You could also use a rolled up towel if you'd like, although that does make it more difficult. I'm going to open that flat, and you can see that because I have clipped these seams, that they lay flatter, and that will be reflected on the other side of the hood when I'm done with this. If I was making this and not doing a lining into it, I would want to finish these edges so that they don't fray. And I could finish those by rolling them thusly and stitching them down. So each of them were rolled this way. So if this was finished, I could do that. Because I'm doing a lining, the lining is going to cover these, and I'm not worried about it. If I was worried about the bulk of these poking somebody in the head, I could also go through and just do a running stitch and sew these down into place to allow them not to fold or bend or bulk up later on, which is a good finishing technique, but we're not going to do it. There are several different ways to finish the edge of our hood. We can bag line the hood, which is like making it into a pillowcase and sewing the lining and the outer together here, and then flipping it inside out, and then finishing the face either by top stitching it or by hand stitching it, or we could bind it. This hood is done with a binding where I take a bias strip, and you can look that up. There's plenty of videos out there to tell you how to make bias strip, and you sew it on, flip it, and either using stitch in the ditch, which you can see in this other video that we will possibly be able to link if our technology allows us to, here, and you can see how it is stitched down. It is done by sewing it to one side, flipping it over, and then turning it and stitching it down to this side. And you can see that that makes a very nice finish edge and gives you the opportunity to add a little bit of color to it. In this case, I am not taking up any seam allowance in my base or around the face, and because of that, I need to cut this edge to where the finished edge is going to be. Whereas on a bag-lined hood, I need to cut this with seam allowance because that seam allowance is going to flip back. And this is what we're going to do for the sake of this video. So when I do that, I need to take a moment and consider how my layers are going to work. One of the ways, if your brain is not manipulating this in a good way, one of the ways you can do it is take your pieces and put them together in the way that you wish. This is turned with the right side out. Ta-da, right side out. And my lining would have the inside or the seam allowance next to the seam allowance of this when it was finished. So if I put that in there and you say, okay, when all is said and done, I want these two layers together to flip. I want this layer here, and that's how this is going to finish. And in that, I have a finished seam on the inside and a finished seam on the outside. Knowing that's how I want it to end, I can say, okay, so this needs to then flip to the outside. And that's how those two seams are going to go together. I cannot sew both the bottom and the face in one go because then I can't turn it back inside out. In this case, I can pin around my base so that the mantle is completely pinned in. I will sew it, and then I will flip it and then finish the face. I don't have to leave myself a little space in here to flip it because I can flip it through the face hole. If I would like for this outside seam and this inside seam to actually match up, I'm going to use my pin, which lies. We know pins lie. But I'm going to use it as a guide. And in order to get these two to line up, I am going to put a pin through this seam here at where my seam allowance is. And I make certain that it has come out in between the two layers of fabric because I don't want to have it go sideways on that. I'm going to put it into the seam allowance here, again, right in that seam, making certain that it goes all the way through. And then I'm going to have it go back through that same seam. I'm going to check it in between my layers because things can shift. And I want to go back through the seam here. See it there? Glint, glint. And bring it through the front here. This is one of the few times I'll actually leave my pin in place when I sew, and that will line up those two seams after I go around this edge. Alright, so now I have sewn around the entire bottom, and you can see that I used a much narrower seam allowance. I just used the width of the foot because this will help this to turn easier as opposed to having to get all that bulk into a smaller area, because on a curve the outside circumference is narrower than the interior circumference that this is all turning into. If I needed to use a wider seam allowance, then I would want to go ahead and cut notches so that it would lay smoothly. With this, it is not so steep nor so bulky that I'm going to have to really worry about it. It will go in fairly smoothly when I turn this. So we're going to turn it through the face, remembering that this is my inner layer, and I have my outer layer and my lining layer are right sides together. So I'm going to turn them through the face of the hood. And because it is a pillowcase, I should be able to pull it apart basically and have a mirror reflection. So there's my lining, and there's my outer hood joined together here at the bottom of the mantle. And then I'm going to bring this inside. You can see here at the edge that my little pin trick lined these guys up. So that seam is beautiful, although honestly it's going to be inside. Nobody's ever going to see it except for me and you when you decide to look at my stuff. Same here. So just a little matter of pride to line them up. I'm going to turn this all to the inside. Camera focus. And then I'm going to press this so that the lining is slightly to the interior, thusly. So I will press it from the inside of it, turning this so that it is just barely seen on the outside. I apologize for this being dark on dark, but the person that this is going to would prefer it that way and doesn't want to have a fancy light colored fabric to the inside. My pressing is now complete. You can see that this has been pressed just slightly so that the interior, the lining, is to the inside of the outer. And you can see just a little lip of the outer there. Now, to finish this off, I could leave it as is, but if I wash it, it is likely that I'm going to need to repress that to make it sit just so again. So I can top stitch this either with the machine and use a narrow width here and top stitch that with the machine, or if I want no machine sewing, I can go ahead and do a small running stitch where I just barely prick the outside and have my stitch length go between the layers and then out and in and out and in, and that will hold it beautifully. Or I could do a decorative stitch. You could embroider leaves all over it, or a knight's chain, or even a master's mantle to it. That would be lovely. In the face, I've decided that what I'm going to do, instead of binding it or otherwise finishing it, I'm going to just turn this to the inside. So I have pressed these in. I've pressed the outside of it to the inside lining, so that everything comes together. And then I'll pin it and I will top stitch it. Now I have the option that I could do it by hand. I could whip stitch this, or I could do a hidden stitch, or I could do a running stitch. All of those are easily available on YouTube if you want to look those up. If I was making a bunch of these, let's say for loaner garb, then I would do this method and top stitch it with the machine, because it's quick and dirty, it looks nice, it will last, and I'm not overly concerned about somebody wanting to judge the period level of it. However, if it is for my own good, then perhaps I would finish that with a hand stitch. Or if you don't have a machine, then hand stitch is the option. When I come to these two layers together, I want to do my top stitch close to this edge so that I catch both layers and I catch where I have turned it. And I've only turned it under about 1/4 of an inch so that it lays without a lot of bulk in here, because that is going to be around my face with my mask over it, so I don't want to have a lot of bulk. Now I will sew the top stitch on the bottom of the mantle. Note that I am keeping a very narrow seam here. And as far as eyeballing it goes, I'm actually looking to have it sit right in here as it goes through, so that it stays same distance as I go. I'm using my fingers to feel here where I've pressed it to make sure that it sits the same. Having it pre-pressed means that I don't have to fight it nearly as much. And I'm going to sew it all the way around. You can see here, now that it is finished, it makes a nice finished edge to it. And now I'm going to sew around the face. In sewing around the face, bear in mind that these are not sewn, so I'm using this stitch to keep these together if I am not doing it as a hand stitch. One of the things that I want to make certain that I catch very well is this seam right here, and I want to do a bar tack across here because that is where this is likely to rip, because that is where the seam is. And even though I did a stop on each of my seams and went back and forward, I want to make certain that that spot stays together. And you can see that I put my pin through. And I've lined these guys up, and I've tucked in the areas that I cut. But that spot right there is the most vulnerable place on this garment because it's being pulled over the head and it is likely to rip right there. So, that said, we put those guys together, put them around the arm of my machine so that I don't catch things I don't want to have sewn together. Straighten that out best we can. And we do that with the bar tack, which means in the sewing machine's case, I just go back and forward. If I'm hand stitching it, then I want to whip stitch over the top of that several times so that it binds it very well. Now I bury my needle so that I can turn this. And you can see the needle's moving as I, because it does go zigzag, it has that ability. So it's kind of giving as I do this. If I had not buried my needle down, I would not be able to line all this back up. So my needle is buried, and again, I'm going to go around this edge, just as I went around the hemline, with a very narrow top stitch. So there you have it. One lined fencing hood with a pillowcase turned base that has then been top stitched at the mantle, and then the face is turned. We have done extra stitching across the seam here at the face so that it doesn't come undone when it's being pulled on and off. It's washable, it's puncture proof, it's lined. I don't have to worry about a bunch of seam finishes because they are all internal. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy making your own hood and make extra and put them in the loaner gear. So well.